Good afternoon and welcome to the Review and Debates. My name is Akash and I lead the club. For those who have been with us before, thank you for joining us again. For those of us who are new to us, we are a debating society and magazine. In terms of the debate society, every week we host informal debates amongst our student membership. Every month we host debates and panels like the wonderful one you're going to witness today. And every 2 months we release an online magazine, student-run, student-submitted, of about 10 or 12 articles. Tomorrow's one is going to come out on the issue of globalization, and our next one is to be decided. It's going to come out at the end of the semester. But that's what we try to do. We're trying to have conversations that matter. We're trying to involve ideas and questions. And the idea that we want to talk about today is this wonderful book that's up there, Our Time Has Come, How India is Making Its Place in the World. It's described as a rising India wants a seat at the table of global powers and is ready to set its own terms in everything from defense to climate to trade. Alyssa Ayres considers how a fiercely independent India seeks its place as a leading power and how the United States should respond. The book was published last month and we have the privilege of its author, Alyssa Ayres' company this afternoon. She has been a friend of India since she spent a term there back in her junior year at Harvard and is one of the world's leading scholars in Indian foreign policy and is a senior fellow for India, Pakistan and South Asia at the Council on Foreign Relations. At CFR, her work focuses on India's role in the world and on US relations with South Asia. In 2015, she served as the project director for the CFR-sponsored Independent Task Force on US-India Relations, and from 2014-2016 as the project director for an initiative on the new geopolitics of China, India and Pakistan. She directs the US Relations with South Asia Roundtable series, blogs regularly for Asia Unbound, and is a contributor to Forbes.com. I served previously as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for South Asia from 2010 to 2013, covering all issues across the dynamic region of 1.3 billion people, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Maldives, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, and providing policy direction for 4 US embassies and 4 consulates. Prior to serving the Obama administration, Ayres was founding director of the India and South Asia practice at McLarty Associates from 2008 to 2010. Immediately prior, she served in the US Department of State as Special Assistant to the Undersecretary for Political Affairs as a CFR International Affairs Fellow. Prior to that, she worked in the non-profit sector at the Center for Advanced Study of India at the University of Pennsylvania and the Asia Society here in New York. Her book on nationalism, culture, and politics in Pakistan, Speaking Like a State, was published worldwide by Cambridge University Press in 2009 and received the American Institute of Pakistan Studies Book Prize for 2011 and 2012. She has co-edited 3 books in India and Indian foreign policy: Power Realignments in Asia, India Briefing, Takeoff at Last, and India Briefing, Quickening the Pace of Change. Ayres has been awarded numerous fellowships and has received 4 group or individual superior honor awards for work at the State Department. She received her AB magna cum laude from Harvard College and an MA and PhD from the University of Chicago, where her dissertation was defended with distinction. Please put your hands together for Alyssa Ayres. Joining Alyssa today is someone known to the world as an esteemed journalist and to us at NYU as one of our professors. Tunku Varadarajan is the Virginia Hobbs Carpenter Research Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University and editor of Hoover's in-house publication, Defining Ideas. A contributing editor at Politico, he is a former editor of Newsweek and Newsweek International. Previously, he was executive editor opinions at Forbes, assistant managing editor and op-ed editor of the Wall Street Journal, and the New York bureau chief for the Times of London. Born in India, he is a British citizen. An adjunct professor at New York University's Department of Journalism, he is a former lecturer in law at Trinity College, Oxford. He has also taught at NYU's Stern School of Business, the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia University, and the City University of New York's Graduate School of Journalism. Ladies and gentlemen, Tunku Varadarajan. With that done, I'm going to leave it to Tunku to open the conversation on the book today.
Thank you, Akash. So this is not a debate, it's a conversation. I want to get that clear at the outset. And I'm just the facilitator because Alyssa is the one who's written the book. So Alyssa, I've read the book, I've even reviewed it. I think I said nice.
It's a very nice review.
Nice.
I'm very grateful for that.
So you went to India for the first time in 1990, 28 years ago. And there's a passage in your book which I love, which you tell us that your parents were a little alarmed when you went to India. And then when you decided to specialize in India studies, your dad was upset because he thought it was a dead-end field and you wouldn't get a job after that. But look at you now, you've got a job.
I do have a job, thankfully.
And it looks like you'll keep it because you've written a terrific book. Tell us, give us a potted summary of the book. That doesn't mean you don't have to read it. So tell the audience what the book's about.
The book's about India's rise on the world stage, and in a sense, what the United States should be thinking about to better partner with and accommodate the ambitions of this rising India. But to convey that narrative, I go through an economic history. The reason I opened with that college semester abroad program in 1990 is because it provides a bookend. The semester actually before the onset of India's economic reforms in the summer of 1991. So a little bit of a window into India's political economy before it began to open to the world economically, before it began to become a much more dynamic economy, before its own businesses became multinationals and interested in pursuing their own international goals around the world. So that kind of takes us through the past to thinking about the present as a moment of transition for India, for Indian foreign policy, and for what Indian leaders seek for their country on the world stage. Part of that also involves a story of India's transition from seeing itself as a leader of the non-aligned movement and from orienting its international ambitions around the idea of non-alignment to a kind of midway point of a theory called strategic autonomy that was employed most notably by the previous Indian government, to a kind of new phase that the Indian foreign policy community is in. Not quite strategic autonomy. The current government doesn't use that term anymore, but they use a term that's a Sanskrit phrase that means the world is a family. When the world is a family, it's okay to develop a strong and deep strategic partnership with the United States. The United States is no longer held at arm's length by Indian foreign policy makers, but at the same time, they also have developed very strong relationships with many other countries: Japan, Brazil, Russia, Germany, the UK. So the world is a family, but in many ways it is also developing, in some manner, equidistant relations with a variety of other partners at the same time. So I talk through some of that. There is a global governance component of the book, and I think that's an important aspect of India's ambitions globally. It is not part of some of the major institutions of global governance through which the United States conducts its most urgent foreign policy work. It's not a member of the NATO alliance. It has no desire to be. It's not interested in that. But it's not a member of the UN Security Council and sees that as a severe global inequity, which I also agree with. So I talk through some of those issues. The book also looks at India's quest to continue expanding its economy and to do so while also creating jobs. It has an important requirement to try to generate at least 1 million jobs a month to accommodate the demographics of the country, people who come of workforce age and need to find productive employment. To date, that has not been an ambition that's been met, so this is a serious challenge for India's economic growth and development. I also look at some of the questions of how India will act as a global power. What kind of trade postures will India adopt, looking at some of the positions that it's taken globally? Will India be an important partner for the United States on democracy? This is something that we hear a lot. India and the US, the world's largest and oldest democracies, or the 2 largest democracies, both statements are true. But India has a very different vision of what it means to promote and think about democracy on the world stage than the techniques the United States has traditionally employed. So sometimes we have some divergences of proposed action, even if we agree on similar assessments of the situation. The final chapter of the book has a series of recommendations for U.S. foreign policy, primarily focused on the U.S. foreign policy community, so the U.S. government, but I also make some recommendations about ways that higher education can better prepare our American next generations for a world in which India is playing a much larger role on the world stage.
Right. Let's give us a little bit of a flavor of what India was like when you first went there. 1990, I can remember it being a different place, different planet almost, from the way it is now.
Yeah.
Give us a sense of what your daily life was like. Where were you? Were you in Delhi? Were you somewhere else?
I travel on a college semester abroad program, and I am to this day a big proponent of foreign study, study abroad programs, semester abroad programs. I was on a program that moved, a program that was administered by the School for International Training, and we began in Delhi for a month, and then moved to Udaipur for 3 weeks, and then went to Ahmedabad for 3 weeks, and we had a family homestay in Surat, and then we went back to Delhi. It was chaotic, I have to say. I mean, this was a period of coalition governments in India. This was when the VP Singh government had decided to implement the Mandal Commission recommendations providing reservations for subordinate castes in India, the equivalent of what we would call affirmative action here, just to gloss for people who are not familiar with the reservations issue in India. But this actually sparked a huge political firestorm, and within the first month of this semester abroad program, there were student protests on the streets. Delhi was shut down for a while. I mean, students were immolating themselves to protest the implementation of these recommendations, so it was really quite volatile. I believe in November of that year, the government fell. There was then a series of, a short-lived coalition government, the Chandrasekhar government. India went into a period of economic crisis, ended up having to put its gold stores, its gold reserves on loan to the Bank of England to secure a loan for its economy. So this is a period of enormous volatility for India. It was a time when I can remember when people talked about the challenge of coalition governments in India not being able to last their full term.
Right, so India's gone from a period when it had to put its goal on a plane to London. Its students were burning themselves to death because they could see no light at the end of the tunnel and they thought their politicians were letting them down. To a place today where, in spite of the fact that there's still a lot of tension and volatility and a number of problems, including one finding jobs, it's an optimistic country, wouldn't you say?
I think there are big parts of India that are optimistic about the future and the direction that the country could go economically. That doesn't mean that all the challenges have been overcome, not by a long shot, and I say that in the book. I mean, there are many different kinds of challenges domestically in India. But I think the title, I think, encapsulates, the title is a quote from the present as well as the former Prime Minister of India. That kind of encapsulates the sense of possibility that people have about where India could head.
So both Modi and Manmohan Singh on separate occasions said our time has come.
Yeah. Specifically about India's role globally.
And you believe that India's time has come?
I think India is now closer to being a kind of recognized global power, and by that I mean one of many powers in a multipolar system. It is closer to that point now than it ever has been in the past. Now, how precisely to measure that, people differ on this definition, but I think one important characteristic is the fact that the Indian economy is emerging as a global heavyweight. It's been the world's 7th largest economy for 3 years running. Projections suggest that India could overtake both the UK and the French economy during this year, during 2018, which would make India the world's 5th largest economy. It's suddenly in a very different kind of category.
I mean, Indians, I've noticed Indians, both ordinary Indians and officials alike, seem desperately keen for India to be seen as a global power.
Yeah.
Why is that? Where does that hunger for recognition come from?
Well, and this is not entirely a new desire. You can, and I go through in the book, there's, of course, earlier writings. You can go back to Nehru, who saw India as playing what he thought was an important role globally, with the potential to mediate. The importance of the non-aligned movement for Nehru was that India stood apart as a kind of neutral country and could play a role in resolving global challenges. I think it didn't actually work out that way precisely, but that was an ambition for India.
It was the global good guy.
A global good guy, exactly. But I think there's a kind of quest for status and recognition that's an important component of this quest, and these are fair comments and criticisms. I mean, it's hard to, when you look at the composition of the permanent members of the UN Security Council, it becomes harder and harder to say why India can't have a permanent seat there.
Should India be a permanent member of the Security Council?
It certainly should be. Oh yeah, and I think the United States should be doing much more to support
Tell us why it should be.
You can run down the range of any metric you like. It could be one of the world's largest countries in population terms, soon to be the world's largest. India's population should overtake China's before the year 2025, according to UN projections. one of the world's largest economies, as we've just discussed, very active participant in UN peacekeeping and has been for years. In a cumulative sense, I believe India is the world's largest contributor of troops to UN peacekeeping. In recent years, it has alternated between being one of the top 1, 2, or 3 troop contributing countries. So it's playing an important role in securing the kinds of most difficult conflicts that the UN does work on around the world. It's active on all sorts of issues in a variety of different UN organizations, but on the security front, it has been active for years. I think if you were to design a UN Security Council with permanent members today, it just wouldn't look the way it does today. And that's something that India, and this is not India's quest alone. India is a very active participant in something called the G4, along with Japan and Germany and Brazil. And these 4 countries together all feel like their contributions in the UN and in security are overlooked and overshadowed, and all 4 of these countries argue for a reformed and expanded UN Security Council in which they would have permanent seats. I certainly think the United States should be doing much more about this. When President Obama traveled to India in 2010 for his big state visit there, he gave a speech before India's parliament, and one of the things he said, and I'll quote exactly, was that the United States supports Indian membership in a reformed and expanded UN Security Council. So we've made that statement and committed to supporting India as a country. I'm not sure we've done so much to actually bring that into reality.
Right. I mean, the moral and metrical case apart, why should America support India's permanent membership? What's in it for America? What does it get from that?
Well, that's an interesting question. Are people looking at this as a matter of what the United States gets? If you were to ask American diplomats who work on UN and international organization issues and people who track, there's a whole metric. Do any of you work on international organizations or UN issues? All right. There is something that the United States State Department tracks on an annual basis. It's a required report to the U.S. Congress, and it's called voting coincidence. And if you look at the voting coincidences between the United States and India, I'm sorry to report it's not great. It's not great at all. And these documents will show, for example, on categories of votes that the United States refers to as important votes. Maybe we'll have a voting coincidence on any given year with India. It could be, let's say, 26%. I mean, these are very low numbers. There's another aspect of the voting coincidence.
By which you mean India and the U.S. voting the same way?
In the same way, yeah. It's not great. And these go up and down depending on the composition of different types of debates during the year. There's another aspect to that, and that's the extent to which India takes positions on votes. And one of the things that I look at, even more closely than the voting coincidence issue, is the issue of abstentions. Because abstentions are about not taking a position on issues. And if you go through these kinds of reports for the last several years, you'll see that India often doesn't take positions on different kinds of votes. So that's another sort of question. As a country that is seeking to have a larger voice in the UN security structure, should it be taking positions more often? It takes positions a lot less often than China does on the UN Human Rights Council. It's another kind of an aspect. This goes back to India's theory of foreign policy under the non-aligned movement. The whole idea of non-alignment was that countries would not interfere in domestic matters of other countries and would leave those aside. They would respect a country's sovereignty to manage its own internal issues. So that meant no weighing in on things like human rights problems in another country, even when they became quite severe.
Right.
So there is a question about this, and people do raise this issue. What kind of India would a permanent member of the Security Council be? And I think that's a fair question, but it's also...
And it's a question, I assume, that's being asked by American policymakers, right?
Well, not in the context of whatever... So what is the reform process is actually a mechanical process that has not really advanced in any way. So that's sort of a separate but related issue. Mm-hmm. And I think that relates also to the problem of bureaucratic inertia. It's very difficult to get reform in any kind of major institution. India has been actively trying to advance reform. 2 years ago they introduced text which they hoped would make its way through a UN process and produce some different outcome, and of course, it didn't.
Let me rephrase the question. What should India do to make itself a more attractive candidate for permanent membership of the Security Council? Obviously, one of them would be abstain less. I see. But
I'm not sure that's the right answer. So I think if you're strategizing from New Delhi's perspective, when you take fewer positions, you are offending fewer countries that have the ability to vote.
okay.
So that must be part of people's considerations on some of these tough issues.
Right, but you're not winning the hearts of the countries that matter. Right. Ultimately, India won't get on the permanent membership, won't get on the Security Council as a permanent member unless certain key countries back it, right?
Right, well, and the social reform process is a real challenge. Will China support Indian membership in a permanent seat on the Security Council? I think that's an open question. I think a lot of people, certainly in India, have concerns about China's unwillingness to support India in reform of institutions of global governance. So the Nuclear Suppliers Group is a prime example of that.
Would you say India is still a non-aligned country? I know they've made great efforts to distance themselves from the old form of non-alignment. I believe Modi didn't even attend the last non-aligned summit.
That's right.
So where do we stand? Is it still useful to talk about India as a non-aligned state? Or is it non-aligned but just not using the word anymore?
It's still a member of the non-aligned movement, perhaps not prioritizing that as a forum in the way it did in the past. But India still seeks to develop the closest possible relationships that it can with as many countries as it can. So that's another way of hedging.
And this is what comes in the way of its developing an even closer relationship with the United States?
I don't know that that necessarily comes in the way. I think that there are a couple cases where many U.S. policymakers and U.S. members of Congress ask questions. Well, what does it mean that India was unwilling to more forcefully condemn the Russian invasion of Crimea, for example? Or when we have big debates on Capitol Hill about Iran and Iran's role in the world. India has a strong and deep relationship with Iran, and it will maintain that relationship. And so people wonder about that.
A lot of people in Washington believe, and I think you believe so too, that the India-America relationship could be the defining relationship of the 21st century. Is that fair to say?
People use the word defining, as you just have. The Obama administration used the word indispensable partnership to describe this. One of the things that I write about in the book is a kind of occasional conceptual confusion with the idea of developing a much closer partnership between India and the United States, and hoping that this becomes an alliance formation, similar to the U.S.-Japan relationship, a deep treaty alliance, or a relationship like the United States has with its NATO partners. I do not believe that that is the future of the U.S.-India relationship. I think that we can have a strong partnership, but I believe India has some very distinct reservations about alliances in general. It does not have them.
I mean, you go to great lengths in your book, in fact, to say that the word alliance is taboo in any India-America conversation. Is that fair to say?
I just don't think that it accurately describes a trajectory of the U.S.-India relationship, and I think that people who expect that to be an outcome will be disappointed at every turn.
So what can we expect?
I believe we can expect a relationship that I described as a joint venture. This term comes from the independent task force that you referred to. We came up with this idea as a way of better reflecting the type of relations we thought was most likely to result between India and the United States. If you have a joint venture between two companies, they have some areas of deep cooperation, but they are doing other things that may not be together. And the separate pursuits do not necessarily impinge upon the success of the joint venture pursuits. So if we try to shift the way we think about U.S.-India relations as something much more akin to a joint venture, it's a little bit easier to envision that you can partner very closely on things like Indian Ocean security while still having some pretty significant differences on the Crimean Peninsula.
I mean, is the United States mentally kind of prepared for a joint venture? My sense is that throughout its history, it's taken a kind of all or nothing approach to relationships with other countries. So a joint venture may be just a little less good than...
Less good than, right. That's why I spent a lot of time on this concept, because I mean, I agree with you. I think that
they want a hug, not a handshake.
Yeah, right, and we have a tendency to, you know, good country, friend, ally. That's sort of how we approach things, and if you're not in the ally basket, you know, where are you situated? So I think it does require some nuance to think through what it means. One reflection of the direction the United States is going on this front, you know, in that kind of space of successfully building something that is a close partnership but not an alliance as we traditionally have, is this new definition of India as a major defense partner. This was something that the Obama administration began, and then the US Congress, bipartisan basis, passed a law that designates India with capital letters, major defense partner. What that does is, under various US laws, export control laws, it allows India to have access to US defense technology at a level akin to those of a US ally or partner. So the purpose of this major defense partner is to kind of bump India up formally and allow us to do new and different things together in defense trade, strategic cooperation. It would be much harder to do otherwise. But it took an act of Congress to create this category that we've never had for any other country before to kind of enable that.
So India is the only major defense partner.
Right.
So the United States has had to get creative with law and language in order to accommodate its relationship with India.
Right, and I think it's important and noteworthy, actually, that we've seen both parties in the United States willing to do so. There's been great continuity in pursuing a deepening of the U.S.-India relationship from different administrations forward. On Capitol Hill, there's quite a bit of support for the relationship with India. It doesn't mean that people are happy all the time, particularly on the economic side, where there are a lot of frictions, but I think you do see that this idea of a closer partner, however it needs to be defined in a way to operationalize it, is quite supported.
But my sense is that there's still quite a lot of residual anti-American sentiment in India, even in policymaking circles. What's that about? Why?
Different dimensions. One dimension is the larger category of suspicion of the foreign hand. Who's heard about the foreign hand? Yes? No? The foreign hand? All right.
Tell them about the foreign hand.
The foreign hand is an idea that foreign influence, foreign capital is deleterious to Indian national interests. During India's period of economic autarky, of course, foreign capital was not allowed. You couldn't have foreign investment. The country has gradually opened up economically. From time to time, you still see and hear people complaining about the challenge of the foreign hand or foreign influence. This is increasingly less so, but there are still real issues on this front. There's a regulation in India about foreign funding for non-governmental organizations, and a deeper degree of suspicion on what foreign contributions, what foreign funding is being used to support. So it's not like a foundation is making a grant on renewable energy or nuclear power or something do undergo scrutiny. But the idea of the foreign hand and the idea of suspicion, oftentimes when Indira Gandhi used to talk about the foreign hand, this was really talking about suspicion of the United States and U.S. influence. You do, from time to time, hear some of that today. I mean, big debates on strategic partnership issues. For example, when the United States and India were negotiating a certain kind of agreement that would allow our defense forces to interact seamlessly by having a seamless way to conduct accounting transfers. This is really, really deeply detailed policy stuff, and not some kind of, I know it gets kind of boring, but in India this was actually front page news. So negotiating what was called a logistics support agreement or a logistics exchange memorandum of understanding became the topic of front page debate. And some people wrote columns against this kind of agreement by saying, you know, this is going to result in the United States making military bases in India and American sailors who will get drunk and come to our country and prey on our, I mean, really kind of outrageous statements, when it was nothing. This was kind of a very mundane operational agreement to allow people to ledger transfers if, I don't know, if a ship docked and refueled. I mean, it was a kind of, it just made it easier to work together. This agreement was signed and came into being a couple years ago. To great celebration on both sides in the strategic communities, but it was really interesting when this was signed under the then Indian Defense Minister, Parakar, and the then U.S. Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter. When they gave a press conference to talk about this, an Indian journalist based in the U.S. asked a question about, well, when could we look at some of the other agreements being signed? And Minister Parakar's reply to this group of journalists was, it took us 13 years to get this agreement done, so let me just get this one settled and explain to everybody, and then we can talk in the future about advancing some other agreems. So,
right.
It's hard to move these things along.
But alongside this residual anti-Americanism, there's also considerable love for America. You see in India, where previously there was no such thing. So the foreign hand is kind of given way to the foreign handshake in many cases. But let's talk about...
and also as schools, if I can just say, I mean, you studied in the UK, you increasingly see people, Indian students, coming to study in the United States, so it creates different kinds of relationships and experiences.
Right, I mean, virtually every senior Indian bureaucrat I know has a child in the United States. So and that must have some psychological impact on the way relations are conducted. But let's move on from there to the Indian diaspora. What role has the Indian diaspora in this country played in all of this?
I think the Indian diaspora has played a really important role in highlighting the importance of the US-India relationship. And they've done so also at key moments like working on Capitol Hill to support the US-India Civil Nuclear Agreement. That was an important moment, 2005 through 2008, and really making their voices heard about why this mattered. Let me also say that they're pushing on an open door in the sense that it's pretty clear to a lot of people that there's a convergence of geopolitical interests between India and the United States. So that case is easier to make. It's not as if people are saying this is an important relationship because we say so. It's because we highlight this and there's so much going on that makes sense. Both countries are concerned about increasing Chinese assertiveness across the entire Indian Ocean region. Both countries are interested in having a better economic relationship and expanding the trade and economic relationship, even though there are plenty of frictions at times. So you've got a whole lot of arenas in which there are a lot of ways that the Indian American community can go to members of Congress and say, look, we've got the following things we want to make sure you know about. Please help us make sure that India remains on the top of the agenda.
And there's a bipartisan consensus.
Yeah.
But not just in the United States, but in India too. I think the Congress and the BJP tend to see eye to eye with some occasional turbulence.
With some occasional turbulence.
But how about, how big is the China factor in all of this? And I've held back from mentioning the C word till 40 minutes into our conversation. But China, what does it mean to India? What does it mean to India-US relations? I mean, should India be scared stiff of China, or what's going on there?
Yeah, I think you've seen a kind of evolution in Indian strategic thinking about China and what China means for India's national security interests, and India's economic interests too, we shouldn't forget. If you looked in the early 2000s to the mid-2000s, India was still working hard to develop something of a strategic relationship with China. That's been challenging, though. There is a border dispute between India and China. There have been an ongoing series of incursions across the border, including at times that have been extremely embarrassing for Indian governments.
Well, it's hard to build a strategic relationship with a country that claims large chunks of your territory.
Large chunks of territory and seems unwilling to have finality to negotiations on that front. There's been 20 rounds of India-China negotiations on the border and no real outcome to date. But the China factor, I think, has grown even more important, and I think the past 3-4 years have been critical to the changing sense of what's happening across the Indo-Pacific, Asia-Pacific region. You've seen increasing Chinese assertiveness in the South China Sea with the island building, with creating infrastructure on those islands, with gradually, apparently, militarizing the infrastructure on those islands. Last summer, the standoff on the Doklam Plateau, which was actually the border between Little Bhutan, a country of 800,000 people, which also has an undemarcated border that remains in a process of open negotiation with China. Chinese troops on that border appeared to begin to make a more permanent road and to extend a road that would deepen their access into area that is disputed between Bhutan and China. And Indian troops stepped in to prevent the change of the status quo. So I think that was actually an important moment also, both in Indian defense and foreign policy.
And to explain that, and that's because India is manages Bhutan's security interests, right, under a treaty.
Bhutan would say that India does not manage Bhutan's foreign policy under a treaty.
You're the diplomat.
They revised that relationship, but they have a very close relationship, and India does defend Bhutan's interests. But part of this was also an issue of just saying, to what extent is this another example, a land-based example of what people have called salami slicing tactics in the South China Sea, sort of beginning to encroach inch by inch before suddenly, after a certain period, you realize that facts on the ground have completely changed while you weren't really paying attention. So India took a pretty firm position on that front. I mean, this standoff lasted for nearly 3 months and was only resolved really on the eve of the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa forum. They had a summit level meeting that was being hosted last year, September 4th, in China, and India and China resolved this standoff issue right before that summit began, presumably so it wouldn't mar the success of this summit in China.
One last question before I throw it open to you, and is you mentioned earlier the India-US nuclear agreement, which is, you know, often cited as an example of how the two countries have grown closer, and how the US has been able to overcome obstacles in a creative way to bring the two countries together. But it's also been a source of great disappointment in Washington, has it not?
Certainly commercially, there's no doubt about that.
Tell us why.
Is everybody familiar with the US-India Civil Nuclear Agreement? Show of hands. Who's heard of it? Okay, we've got about half people here have heard of this agreement. So the signature US-India initiative of the George W. Bush administration was something called the US-India Civil Nuclear Agreement. And what that agreement did, for more than 30 years, US-India ties had been at loggerheads over this issue of nuclear non-proliferation. It was the very top agenda item for US diplomacy. Sanctions that the United States had on India because of its own nuclear weapons program prevented much closer cooperation and defense and high technology. What the George W. Bush administration decided was that India's rise as a global power was strategically important and of long-term national interest for the United States, and we needed to find a way to work together despite disagreements on the fact that India never signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, yet had tested nuclear weapons. What the George W. Bush administration did was create an initiative that worked closely with India. India agreed to separate its nuclear program to have energy programs, so civilian reactors that would make power and energy for Indian economic growth, and to separate out its military program, what's called its strategic program. India developed something called a separation plan. India agreed to put its civilian energy reactors under International Atomic Energy Agency safeguards, and they had a plan for that, so it was going to be monitored by the UN agency in charge of this issue. The United States changed its law, and this is where the Indian American diaspora was very important in speaking to their representatives on Capitol Hill. The United States changed its law to allow US industry to work with India on civil nuclear energy. And the United States worked internationally in multilateral fora, specifically something called the Nuclear Suppliers Group, this becomes important later, to pass something called an exemption for India. The countries that were in the NSG were prohibited from conducting any kind of commercial trade with India. That meant, sending uranium to India. They weren't allowed to do that because India was not allowed under this regime. In 2008, the Nuclear Suppliers Group did in fact pass this exemption to allow trade with India on this front. So India has looked to build out its nuclear energy platform. Now, India also, its parliament passed a liability law that had to do with the way suppliers would bear some liability for any eventual, if problems were to ever take place in nuclear energy. One result of the liability law was that it became harder and harder for American private nuclear energy operators to figure out how to sign a deal in India. Today, the only international presence in India's civil nuclear energy sector is Russian. So this is an area where you do hear a lot of disappointment in the United States. People will say, well, we did this nuclear deal and there's no American reactor underway. Yeah. On the other hand, there has been a really important strategic outcome. So the security and defense relationship has been enabled. The United States changed its export control laws to permit deeper defense trade with India. India changed its own laws on different aspects of non-proliferation. It has now become a member of 3 out of the 4 global non-proliferation regimes. The United States has supported this process. The only one it's not a member of now is the Nuclear Suppliers Group.
Right, so while there's been great commercial disappointment, there's been a great deal of strategic advancement.
Absolutely, yeah, and it's a really important point to keep in mind. If you were to ask anybody who was involved with US-India relations, let's say in the late 1990s, before and after India's nuclear tests, if you were to ask anybody from that period, would you ever imagine that India would become a member of the Missile Technology Control Regime and the Wassenaar Arrangement and the Australia Group? I think it would have been unimaginable for people. So this actually is a very significant advance. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But the commercial aspect has been, I think, disappointing to a lot of people. Yeah.
Because that was, in fact, the way the deal was sold in many ways.
It was one aspect. Another aspect was bringing India inside the global non-proliferation tent, and that has been successful.
Okay, so I'd love to hear questions from anyone in the audience who'd like to. I just ask you, before you ask the question, just to say your name. Yes.
Hi, I'm Natalie. So as India becomes an increasingly dominant player on the world stage, how do you think that will change, or if at all, the India-Pakistan relationship?
That's a great question. I'm glad somebody asked it. You know, I think that India sees its global interests in ways that are much larger than just its problems with Pakistan. And it used to be that people would talk about South Asia and the most important issue would surface would be the India-Pakistan relationship. I think India now has a variety of issues on the global stage. It still has problems with Pakistan, but it has its own desires and ambitions in global governance, in shaping global energy security, in its ties with China, in obtaining primacy in the Indian Ocean. Of course, protecting its homeland from terrorism is a top priority, and it does have problems with Pakistan. But I think you see that now falling as one of several issues of importance for India. And I think you see people around the world recognizing that shift as well. You know, Pakistan is increasingly looking inward. It has some very, very difficult problems of its own. Its problems with its relationship with Afghanistan as well. You know, you can see a kind of transition in the way different countries are trying to manage their own relationship with Pakistan. So I think that India becoming a larger economy, becoming a larger global player, it starts to have involvements in many different spheres, and its ties with Pakistan become one sliver of a much bigger pie instead of remaining kind of a single outstanding issue.
Just going off that, and you talked a lot about India making its place in the world. And also talked initially about the differences in the US and India views on democracy promotion, the relationships with the neighbors, and talking about India's place in South Asia with what's happening in a country like Maldives. In the 80s, Operation Cactus, they went in, they replaced, and they promoted democracy in a certain way. How is India's new position affecting the way it deals with its smaller neighbors, Nepal, Bhutan we talked about, Maldives, Sri Lanka, and where does India see itself in South Asia?
I think India sees itself as the region's dominant power. It has worked hard in recent years to improve its relations with the neighbors to varying degrees of success. The biggest success has been India-Bangladesh ties. That's been a really interesting case where you've seen both India's previous government and the present Indian government work very successfully, actually, to overcome a border dispute that had dated all the way back to 1947. Actually, now I'm going on a long digression here. This is pretty important. The India-Bangladesh border was at one time the world's most complicated border, where you had islands of extraterritoriality, a piece of Bangladesh inside a finger of India. And in one case, there was enclaves within enclaves. So, and this was actually terrible for people who lived inside these places because they didn't have a full provision of services, access to schools, a power grid, these kinds of things. India and Bangladesh tried to regularize their border in the 70s. Bangladesh passed a law in their National Assembly, and India never reciprocated. The previous Indian government then tried to advance this border regularization. It didn't make it through Parliament, but there was a lot of support for it, but it didn't pass as law. In 2014, it actually did. So they have gone through a process of regularizing these enclaves, making sure that people have access. They've exchanged territory. That's a very big deal. That has made a big difference and a measurable difference in real people's lives. The India-Sri Lanka relationship, which was actually quite tense during the Rajapaksa regime, has changed quite a bit, become much more positive. That in large part has to do, in my analysis, with the change of government in Sri Lanka to a government that is much more India-friendly. India had been concerned about the treatment of Sri Lanka's Tamil minority under the previous government and its lack of progress on reconciliation. India and Nepal has been a little bit more tense. And you saw that after Nepal wrote a new constitution in 2015, the Indian government, by the way, it took 10 years to do that, and the Indian government didn't come out with any sort of strong statement of congratulations. In fact, they were pressuring Nepal to revise their constitution to accommodate people who live along the bordering areas. And Nepalis feel that India was too intrusive on that front. So that relationship, in fact, remains quite tense. Nepalis believe that the Indian government helped coordinate what they call a blockade that prevented trucks from going into Nepal. The Indian government said they did no such thing, but that the truck drivers were afraid because there were riots along the borders. Well, either way, this was actually quite bad economically for Nepal and has created a real sense of tension that remains to this day. So Maldives is an interesting case. Maldives and Sri Lanka are the two cases where you see kind of the most extreme aspects of India and China's competition for influence in the region. So I am actually watching very closely what will be happening on the current issue with the political unrest in the Maldives. China has been one of the most important extraterritorial players in Maldives. I mean, up until 5 or 6 years ago, they were the only other external, other than India and I think Bangladesh, the only other external country that had an embassy in Maldives. And Chinese tourists are the major source of tourism in Maldives. The economy runs on tourism and fish exports, tuna. And so China really matters a lot to Maldives. So let's see how this unfolds.
Yes?
I have an overarching question, and that is, in your estimation, what is the secret of India's democracy? It has such a huge population. It has had tremendous poverty. It had a background of a caste system. Why has India been able to be so democratic? And the sub-question relates to Marx's comment that British imperialism was a terrible thing, but on the other hand, it put India on the track of modern economy. So what, in your estimation, is the legacy of colonialism, imperialism in India today?
Gosh, those are two giant
I was going to
questions.
say, I'm not sure I can do justice to those questions. I mean, there are whole schools of inquiry on each individual component of your question. I mean, let me just say on the democracy question, I think Indians are still working out this question for themselves. I mean, it was a real leap of faith in India's own ability to have universal suffrage at its income level in 1947 and at its literacy level, and to the extent that it has been, you know, the world's most amazing example of democracy at this scale. It's been a very powerful model. India still continues to have all the problems that you highlighted. It isn't that there was a caste, there still is a caste system. There still are problems of violence against women. There are still problems of deep poverty. There are still problems of regional inequality, inequality between urban and rural locations. So there are all these kinds of issues that the country is still working to deal with, but it has continually delivered free and fair elections for all of its people. I mean, it's an incredible thing that, you know, 900 million people are eligible voters in the last election.
But how do you explain that mindset, that there had to be a tremendous drive toward that kind of an objective, and where does that come from? How would you define it?
Well, that I can't explain beyond the fact that that was the decision that the country's founders took, and I think it was prescient.
I mean, there had been some experience of democracy in the years preceding independence, so there was a pattern of practice that people were familiar with. It was not democracy on the scale that you saw in independent India. But as Alyssa says, it was a leap of faith. It was a decision that was taken by the founding fathers and mothers of the country, and I do think the world held its breath for a few years. And I guess what you have, without going into the psychological and sociological explanations, I think what you also have here is a kind of very impressive and beautiful kind of inertia at work, because elections have taken place and because they've worked and people have seen them take place and seen them work, they continue to take place and continue to work. So there's a kind of rolling model which people see no reason to depart from. But interestingly, democracy hasn't worked perfectly in those parts of India that, those parts of South Asia that were India but are no longer India.
Yeah, that's certainly true, yeah.
So, which is remarkable, if I may pick up on your one remark, that people have seen it work, and therefore, we've seen countries in Europe break down. I mean, democracy had worked there, and then bang, something happens, it didn't, and there's a return or a turning toward authoritarianism. So it's an enigma, I think.
Right, and as Alyssa said, it's a question that we and several others grapple with. There's no
I mean, it defies democratic theory. It shouldn't be happening. Democratic theory says, you know, you have to build up a middle class, and you do this, and you have an educated class, et cetera, et cetera. Economic development, that's the process.
Time to revisit the theory.
That's my point.
Yeah. Did you have a question? No. I think you did, right?
Well, you're defining democracy very narrowly in terms of electoral democracy. It's really not the kind of representative democracy that one would aspire to for a really democratic country.
Are you saying that India is not a proper democracy in effect?
Well, I'm saying that all of the praise that you're directing towards Indian democracy is a very limited notion of democracy.
No, I don't think anyone here would disagree that India is a deeply flawed democracy.
Exactly, yeah.
But there's no question.
Yeah, there's no question about that.
But I think we were talking really about the process.
But only the voting process, no other part or aspect of democracy.
Do you want to comment on that, Alyssa?
I'm just not sure what you'd like.
She's talking about procedural. It's a procedural democracy.
Yes, I mean, people have the right to vote. They are denied a whole other range of rights.
Maybe you can tell us about some of the flaws of Indian democracy as you see them. Do you think that would? Because I think that's what the lady's getting at.
Yeah, so, I mean, India has a range of flaws, and there's no question about that. My book is about India's role on the world stage. Let me just note that there are many scholars of Indian democracy, people like Ashutosh Varshney,
Yes.
whose book, Battles Half Won, looks in deeper detail at all of these questions. I look at this question as an issue of collaboration between India and the United States, and how India views its position as the world's largest democracy with something of a model second to none on scale, and how it sees itself as a beacon for others. It doesn't seek to use its role as a kind of big stick around the world. It typically doesn't speak out very vocally on cases outside of the region. So I look at this aspect. You know, as I mentioned, India tends not to take positions in the UN Human Rights Council on votes that have to do with democratic flaws or problems in other countries for reasons linked to its focus on non-interventionism dating from the non-aligned movement. So to me, that is an aspect that is a little bit of a paradox, where you've got a country that has a lot of ability to stand as a model for others, but it sees that as a kind of form of soft power. It's happy to provide technical advice if other countries ask for it directly, but it won't in the way that the United States will say to countries around the world, we think your country has some problems, here is what we would recommend. That's not typically what India does. It will do that in some examples close to home within the region, such as with the case of Nepal. Your question, I think, is intended much more at the challenges that India faces with consolidation of democracy and the depth of its institutions. And I agree that there are all kinds of challenges there. It's just that my book is focused on the international aspect of that.
But it's hard to be a beacon for the rest of the world when you have internal problems that are such a dominant factor.
Well, that's right, and I do write about the fact that the challenge to India, if it relies on its democracy as a soft power aspect, it becomes harder to maintain that soft power to the extent that it continually has deeper problems with its own democracy at home.
Repression, violence in Kashmir, violence in various parts of the country.
I have a question. How many of Indian citizens go out and vote when there is an election? What's the percentage of the voting turnout? Like, roughly? Or, I'm just curious.
Yeah, so I mean, I didn't look that up before we came
That's
here,
okay.
but
It's substantial.
yeah, it varies.
Higher than in the US.
It's higher
Well, that's
than the
not
US.
surprising at all.
But the very interesting thing is that it's a kind of inverse pyramid from the United States. So typically in wealthier urban locations, you'll see lower voter participation, and in less prosperous rural locations, you'll see much higher voter participation. So in a sense, again, that's a kind of empowerment for people with the ability to kick out leaders they don't feel are performing for their interests.
Why don't we have that?
Yes.
In part to return to the international scope, Modi has been actively pursuing his neighborhood first policy, but the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative cuts into a lot of India's neighbors. How do you see that initiative kind of impacting India's predominance in the region?
Let me answer that first with the fact that India, very early on, was one of the few countries in the world that said, we're not all in on this Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah, exactly.
India very, very vocally did not send a representative to attend the Belt and Road Forum that took place last May. And they issued a statement from the foreign ministry that sort of highlighted what they thought were the flaws of the Belt and Road Initiative. And India, as a sort of formal statement of its view on Belt and Road, said we're in favor of infrastructure development. India has partnered with China in the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. India has partnered with China in developing the new development bank, which is something that came out of the BRICS forum. But what they said about the Belt and Road is that it makes non-transparent types of agreements with countries. It's unclear what the repayment terms might be for countries. It's not clear what environmental impacts could be. And so it sort of listed a whole number of points about which it thought that the Belt and Road was not conducting infrastructure development in a manner consistent with international principles. So they've been very vocal about this globally. Now, how does that affect, how does the Chinese Belt and Road set of investments affect India's interest in the region? This is something that Indian policymakers have been very concerned about because they feel that there's suddenly a lot of Chinese influence in the countries that surround them, and it's kind of happened all of a sudden. The paradigmatic case now has been Sri Lanka, which under the previous Sri Lankan government entered into a number of infrastructure projects that were underwritten by Chinese state-owned enterprises. Nobody ever divulged what the terms of these infrastructure projects would be, and it turned out these were basically market loans. These are not kind of World Bank below market rate loans, and it turned out that the Sri Lankan government couldn't afford the debt repayments. So they have now negotiated away an equity stake in a major port in a place called Hambantota, built in a location that appears not to be commercially viable, but it was the former president's hometown. And the Sri Lankan government ended up negotiating away a 70% equity stake to a Chinese state-owned enterprise in this port. That happened late last year. So people who are looking at the Belt and Road look at that as an example of really what are the longer-term effects of the Belt and Road Initiative, and what will that mean? Does that mean that if a country has signed up for some port or airport or something, and they didn't realize that it was going to cost so much down the line, that they too will have to sign away territory to be able to hold it?
One belt, one road, one Chinese port.
Yeah.
But Pakistan too is grappling with these questions.
The same thing, yeah.
You're seeing an almost action replay of Hambantota happening in Gwadar,
Which, yeah, seems set at this point to become perhaps even a military base for China. That seems to be the next step.
And it isn't just India that's concerned about One
Right.
Belt, One Road. It's Macron, Theresa May, if she counts. And I think
You know, the Trump administration actually has raised this as an issue. Secretary of State Tillerson gave a speech last fall, maybe October or November. I would urge you to read the speech because it's almost entirely about Belt and Road issues. It was before his visit to India. And he gave the speech and he spoke about what he called predatory economics, and he was referring to the Belt and Road investments and what they meant. And Tillerson called for India and the United States to try to work together to find financing alternatives for the much needed infrastructure across this enormous region of the Asia Pacific.
Do we have time for another couple of questions?
We do, yeah.
Anyone else want to weigh in? Observations?
No, I have a question.
Yeah.
If that helps. I was just interested, I mean, I think this doesn't apply to a room that chose to spend their lunch hour with us talking about India, but in terms of the...
But you gave everybody lunch.
We did,
Yeah.
yeah. They came for food at least, maybe.
Yeah.
But early in the book you talk about, this historical Western lack of interest in understanding, where Indian thought came from pre-1947. You talked about, the ignorance of something like the Arthashastra versus the art of war by Sun Tzu. Where do you think that came from, and how do you think that has either affected or stymied the Western understanding of Indian action and foreign policy, and what kind of real concerns have emerged from that ignorance of those things?
Well, I mean, where did it come from? In the United States, most of our higher education curricula has been developed with a view towards Western classics.
Mm-hmm.
And so you had, in the 60s, the development of some coursework non-Western focused at places like the University of Chicago or the University of Pennsylvania. But that hasn't percolated throughout every program in every institution everywhere in the United States and or in other countries. So I think that's been a problem. I use the art of war as an example to show where there has been, I think, a growth of interest in the strategic thinking of another country as its own role on the global stage has increased. We haven't yet really seen that for India. That's why I wrote about that. And I think that is an issue. Why isn't this seen as important or worthy of some amount of study?
Could that possibly be because, until recently, the Indian classics didn't necessarily inform Indian strategic thinking? These things are coming into their own now, whereas the Chinese strategic thinking.
It could be, yeah, it could be.
At NYU, I know the undergraduates are reading Indian strategic thinking because my son is in his class, along with Chinese and other.
I did not know that, and that is great.
And he should have been here today.
Exactly. I think he's likely.
you have a chance to ask one of the world's leading experts on India a question. Don't miss it.
I suppose we can clarify my previous question about
You get a special medal, by the way.
about the Belt and Road Initiative. My question isn't necessarily the flaws in it. There are tons. When you get into terrorism, dispersion, too, it gets very tricky, especially with the Chinese-Pakistani economic corridor. But my question is more that if China engages a lot of India's neighbors, do you see that as threatening to India's kind of predominance in the region itself? Kind of the flaws of the initiative itself? If China continues to engage its neighbors so much, do you think that will kind of threaten India's leadership in its area?
Yeah, this isn't an if. So New Delhi has been worried about that as an issue for at least 10 years because China's investments in the smaller countries surrounding India predate the declaration of the Belt and Road Initiative. So the Sri Lankan example actually, Belt and Road was declared, what, in 2012, 2013? The maps were drawn in late 2013 and came out in 2014. But what they were working on with Sri Lanka began in 2006 or 2007. The China-Pakistan relationship is one of long-standing. So I would actually call that an outlier, although the relationship has many structural similarities. But China's relationship with Bangladesh, with Maldives, with Nepal, Burma, these are very similar in a sense. So India's been concerned about that for some time. There was a study done by Booz Allen some years ago, in the early 2000s, in which they talked about a string of pearls strategy. They described China's strategy to develop deep relationships with countries around the Indian Ocean area as a string of pearls, right, with these kind of dots of partners throughout the region. This got picked up and people think that India called the Chinese strategy, I mean, it was actually made up by Booz Allen. But in any case, this is absolutely a concern and has been, and I think that's also why you've seen India working hard to develop better ties with Bangladesh, with Sri Lanka, and trying to figure out exactly what to do with Maldives at a kind of moment of big tension. I'd call it a status quo, if not deteriorating relationship with Pakistan, independent of what's happening on the Belt and Road front.
And I guess in its own way, perhaps belatedly, it's also trying to play China's game by engaging ASEAN more closely and engaging in ties with Vietnam.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Intruding into Chinese space.
Yeah, exactly. Well, its relationship with Vietnam is the best example of that. India went from having a look east strategy to something that they call an act east strategy, trying to become a little bit more active in its relationships with the ASEAN countries. India is looking to make sure that its concerns are protected in the region, and of course it is struggling with how to respond to this huge influx of capital coming from the Belt and Road.
Now, we can't have a conversation about India and the United States without asking the obvious question. What does Trump mean for India?
Yeah, so far on the strategic front, we've seen the Trump administration continue with the same trajectory that the Obama administration and the George W. Bush administration and the Clinton administration had stewarded previously. And I think that's been positive. They've got some very good people in the administration working on these issues. I think on the economic front, it's been a little rockier. One aspect of that is the Trump administration's focus on trade deficits. Never before have we seen trade deficits be a kind of feature of focus in the myriad of frictions in U.S. economic ties. It's about a $26 billion deficit between the U.S. and India. India's, I think, ranked number 10 or 12 on the list of countries with which the U.S. runs a deficit. And that's something that the U.S. Trade Representative talks about a lot. They talk about pursuing free and reciprocal trade instead of just free and open trade, which is a shift in position. You've also seen the administration become much more vocal about their dissatisfaction with our immigration policy on high-skilled workers. To be honest, the way our immigration laws work, the executive branch just can't kind of tweak things. The only way you can have major change to our immigration system and the way it works is for Congress to pass a new law, because Congress really has oversight over the way our immigration system works. So I would not expect to see any major changes on that front, absent a full debate and seeing kind of legislation move through Congress. But I think foreign policy people in India are concerned on that front because the rhetoric coming out about it has
Trump has also talked tough on Pakistan to great applause in India.
Well, when it comes to the issue of the U.S. South Asia strategy, I think the U.S. policy towards Pakistan has been something that India's strategic planners welcome. They have welcomed a much tougher position on Pakistan. The Trump administration has decided to suspend security assistance to Pakistan, absent seeing more action against the Haqqani network and other terrorist groups. And the Trump administration also has been very vocal about welcoming India's economic development role in Afghanistan, which New Delhi has also welcomed as a recognition of the positive role they play there. So you see some continuity with the past, you see some continued frictions on the economic side, and you see, in terms of Afghanistan, Pakistan, South Asia strategy, you see a position that the Indian government has welcomed.
I think we in India tend to be very, like you said, optimistic at a certain level of society about what comes next. What do you see as the biggest, internal, external threat to stop that rise? That that these prime ministers coming up and saying our time has come now.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think and we're pretty much in conjunction on that. There is going to be no change of that thinking. Most leadership thinks that yes, India is to be this major power, this great role. We talked a bit about Ramachandra Guha saying India should not be a great power, should not be a superpower in the book. But mostly at the leadership level, internally, India sees itself to have the position. What is the biggest thing that could stop that? Whether is it a domestic political failures returned in the 90s of collapsed governments? That's not very likely.
I just don't see that happening.
Yeah.
I mean, because I don't see that type of scenario happening, to me the biggest risk is the inability to keep economic growth at high rates over a sustained period. I think that is the single most important factor to India's ability to realize its own ambitions and to be able to maintain that growth and also create jobs.
As you said, India needs to find 1 million jobs a month.
Yeah, yeah.
On that sobering note,
I guess our time has
And
come.
were it not to do that, what would be the impact on its democracy?
I don't know how to answer that question. That is so enormous of a question. That really is one of the most important questions for India's future.
It seems to be at the heart of the matter,
Yeah.
right?
yeah, but I think we can all imagine what it would be like if we had millions of unemployed young people in India. I think the impact on democracy is likely to be negative, scary.
Well, that's for sure.
But how it will play out in specific terms, we'd just be gazing into a crystal ball. But it's not something to look forward to.
Any
Okay.
final questions? Oh, seeing one more. Okay, sure.
I was reading it's kind of been floated that the Quad, the U.S., Japan, and Australia and India, is there are people that propose it might be the new NATO or the Asian NATO. How do you think that would, or do you think that carries any weight in terms of the Quad becoming a significant strategic and security force?
I have a very firm opinion on this, and that is that it will not be the new NATO. India is not interested in a defense treaty. NATO is a defense treaty. Partners within NATO have treaty obligations to each other. An attack on one is an attack on all. That's Article 5. The Quad is a framework for consultation. And to that extent, that's a terrific way to share views, try to coordinate certain kinds of exercises or possible project collaboration. But it's very different from the treaty obligations that are inherent to an alliance. I think the Quad is likely to continue as a consultative structure, not only on military and security issues, but also on economic and other types of issues in which we coordinate with those countries, but it's not a new NATO.
But it's better than the alternative, which is no Quad.
It's right,
Sure.
right. All consultation is better than no consultation.
Okay, thank you for joining us. We unfortunately could not get book copies of the book because it's doing so well that it's out of stock for the week. But Alyssa has very kindly brought these postcards that you can feel free to take. And other than that, please put your hands together for our two panelists.